we now broaden the conversation on resilience, preparing for and overcoming adversity. This session will feature conversationists Michelle Nunn, Mami Mizutori, and Julia Novy-Hildesley, talking about how women leaders can shape more resilient societies in a range of ways, from their responses to threats like COVID-19, to the mitigation of disaster risks, to the amplification of diverse political leadership.
Welcome, everyone, and thank you for joining our conversation on resilience, building on so many important earlier conversations today on such an important topic. I'm thrilled to have Mami Mizutori and Michelle Nunn with me today to explore this topic. So much, as you know, has been written about resilience, and it's certainly a topic front and center on our minds now, certainly over the last several months with COVID-19, but more globally as we face urgent and complex global challenges and existential risk. So I just am thrilled to think about resilience today and would challenge us to maybe go beyond the traditional definition we often hear about bouncing back, which sort of implies going back to where we were, and shift to a perhaps more forward-looking orientation about resilience, that we really emerge stronger and wiser as we go through stresses and shock. And this part of the resilience building process puts us in good stead as we face future challenges. So today we're going to explore, how do we cultivate this kind of resilience at all scales in society, in ourselves, in our communities, and globally. And I can't think of two better people to help us explore that topic today. So Michelle, let me turn to you. And I am aware that CARE has recently surveyed women in over 40 countries to look at how they are coping with COVID-19. Can you tell us a few of the stories of resilience you've learned from that study, and also what insights it offers to women leaders who are working to build equitable and resilient societies as we face and strive to recover from COVID-19?
Yeah, thanks so much, Julia. It is really a wonderful definition to think about, also sort of moving forward versus just catching up. And I think that's what we see women around the world doing. CARE did what we call rapid gender analysis to really determine what are the true conditions that women are facing around the world. And as you said, over 40 different countries. And what we heard are voices like Elizabeth from Ecuador, who's holding down 2 jobs and still having to skip a meal every day, or Karine in Cameroon, who's been isolated from her family, but has still found a way of delivering food and supplies to caregivers and to those who needed support. So we see literally the definition earned with issues of hunger, of jobs, and also mental health. And we can imagine, because of the extra caregiving responsibilities and the extraordinary set of additional responsibilities and threats that women and families are facing. And so I think the lesson is we need to make sure that we are hearing from the women who are on the front lines around the world, that we're hearing from the most grassroots leaders, as well as using that information to ensure that women leaders who are at the decision-making tables are taking that into account and are formulating their responses with those voices and with those leaders at the table.
Absolutely. Thank you. Mami, let me turn to you. You've also worked a lot with women, which I think we'll get into in a moment. But first off, just with your global perspective, working to reduce risk to disasters and build resilience to be more prepared when disaster strikes, can you share with us some of the ingredients of preparing and putting in place measures to strengthen resilience?
Thank you, Julia. So let me give you 8 ingredients for a good recipe for reducing disaster risk and also building resilience. So the first thing is good risk governance. We know that if you have a plan with a vision, with good institutions and a budget to it, then you can manage the risk. We've seen this in COVID-19, countries which have been more successful and countries which have not been that successful. So first and foremost, good risk governance. Failure to plan is a plan for failure. The second ingredient is strong political leadership. It's not easy to invest in resilience or risk reduction because you're trying to prevent something terrible to happen, but you don't know whether it's really going to happen or when it's going to happen. So you have to be a bold political leader in order to do this. The third one is understanding that contemporary risk is everywhere. They're connected and systemic. Michelle just mentioned about hunger, job insecurity, and also mental health. These are all connected, aren't they? So we need to understand the nature of these issues that surround us. The fourth is inclusivity. And in this, we talk about the group of people who are vulnerable. Important thing is that we don't only try to protect them, but we make them part of the solution. That is inclusivity in leaving no one behind. The fifth one is all of society approach. When it comes to building resilience, when it comes to reducing risk from disasters, we think of the government as the one who is primarily responsible. That is true, but it is about the whole of society in terms of the private sector, in terms of academia, science, and of course, civil society organization like CARE. The sixth one is risk is global, but resilient is important at the local community level. Again, we've seen this with COVID-19, that communities are the ones which are at the forefront of building resilience and preventing and responding. The seventh one is multi-hazard approach. So disasters, stress, they don't wait their turn to attack us. While we are in COVID-19, a terrible hurricane attacked Central America, a typhoon in Philippines, earthquake in Croatia. So we need to be ready to have these things coming to us at the same time. And the eighth and last one I say is the importance of peer learning. What better way is there to learn from your peer, whether it's a country or a community or a city? You learn best from your peers. I think those are the 8 good ingredients for a good recipe for risk reduction in building resilience.
Thank you, Mami. I'm curious, Michelle, as you've worked in so many countries, have you noticed the presence of some of these ingredients in the countries that seem to be coping better or more resilient, not just as they face COVID-19, but over the last several years of your work with CARE USA?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I think that is a brilliant recipe. And I think one of the things that I would lift up is the interconnections and the importance of kind of a comprehensive way of considering resilience. And I also think it's really important for us to recognize that women in all emergencies and disasters are hit harder because they are the least equal in most societies. And so we know that, and we see this everywhere, but those who are already marginalized often pay the highest price in emergencies and in crisis. And so I think we need to make sure that we have the data to understand what the impact is from a gendered perspective. And that we also need to recognize, again, as Mami said, the interconnections here, because it is about women's, it's not only about, for instance, women's economic power, because in the informal markets, for instance, they are in the surveys that we've done, 55% to 33% of men, 55% women, 33% are saying that their livelihoods have been affected. So we know that it's not just economics and economic inclusion that matters for resiliency, but it's also voice and agency and leadership. And so I think it is really important to look at the various different dimensions of this. And we also know that basically when you have women at the decision-making table, whether it's a COVID task force for a country, whether it's actually the leadership of a country, or whether it's on corporate boards, that diversity allows for more resilient institutions and better decision-making.
Thank you. I'd love to highlight that point about interconnectedness, because I think that's at the core of resilience thinking. And I think it's absolutely essential that we as leaders and society in general shift to resilience thinking. All of us need to learn how to do it. And it really is about recognizing that we are part of a highly interconnected system. I don't think there's a better time than now to have this mindset shift, because we have all globally been affected by COVID-19. And if it's taught us one thing, it's that we are totally interconnected. So just a small example of what resilience thinking looks like as compared to sort of our traditional ways of thinking, where we're caught in these kind of beliefs about living in a fragmented world where things are disconnected. We're sort of abstracted from things so that we don't see the whole. And this has led us to, of course, the state we're in, where we've got systems that are delivering a lot of perverse outcomes rather than the kind of holistic improvements we'd like to see in our global community. So one example is in fisheries. We used to operate with this concept of maximum sustainable yield. You know, just look at the population of fish. We'll figure out how much it can reproduce, and we can take the maximum amount that we can take while allowing the population to reproduce. But that was not from a resilience thinking perspective, because it did not look at the whole ecological system that fishery occurs in. We're now shifting to ecosystem-based management, where we look at, gosh, if you take that maximum sustainable yield, but you do it in such a way like bottom trawling that completely destroys the structure and habitat, you're undermining the capacity for that population to recover. And so I think we're starting to get this point of total interconnectedness, and that is at the heart of resilience thinking. So Mami, I want to shift to you with that perspective and talk a little bit about the work that I'm familiar with that you've been doing with women, and looking at bringing women into the system, and women who can often see these systems connections perhaps more effectively than others who've been in charge of resilience building and disaster risk reduction in the past. What can they offer us, and how do they bring this kind of unique systems level thinking to bear?
So in communities, we already know that a lot of the community workers are women, because they actually know what is happening there, and they actually know who they should be talking to in order to build resilience and in order to reduce disaster risk. Also, at the level of cities, we have quite a lot of very, very powerful women leaders. I've met one in Kenya in a place called Kisumu. She was a very, very powerful leader. She's called a mama in the African community. And she goes around talking to everybody and finds out what's the problem. And they find it easier to talk to her because she's a woman, right? But what is lacking maybe at this point is women's leadership at the government level, in the specific disaster risk management. So most governments have what we call a national disaster risk management agency. In the case of the United States, it's FEMA. And because the disaster risk reduction, building resilience has a historical background of civil protection, which was associated more with the military, there are more men in the domain. Which is fine, because they did a good job in responding better to disasters and making sure that resilience is built. But we need to go one step further of prevention and starting to reduce risk from the beginning. And for this, we need more women leadership, because they know what we need to do. So there's a project that we just started at my organization, which is called Women's International Network on Disaster Risk Reduction in Asia Pacific. This is a project which is funded by the Australian government, which puts a lot of emphasis on gender. And we are going to actually try to create in Asia Pacific a network of women who specifically work in these agencies, coping with disaster risk reduction. As I mentioned, peer learning is the best way. And you also need mentors from the same gender. And this is what this project will do. This is a 3-year project, first in Asia Pacific, and hopefully now after that going global.
It's exciting, and it sounds like that dispersed network of women being so able to connect with and sense what's going on in their environment may really increase the capacity to adapt quickly to sudden changes or shocks. Michelle, do you have any comments on that with things that you've observed at CARE?
Well, I think it's so important, and Mami so well articulated it. We recognize that women are often disproportionately impacted by disasters and emergencies, but they're also disproportionately powerful if we put them at the center of our response. If we take into account the data of how they're impacted, if we engage them in as informing our response, and if we also put them as leaders. And so I think that that we know that we will be more resilient with with their leadership, and as part of the complexity and the interconnection that you well articulated, Julia, which is at the core, I think, of our continued capacity for building resilience. I would also just articulate that I think we do need to ensure, in order to have true resilience over time, we need to ensure true equal rights over time, and ensure that rights are observed, as well as building resilience.
Wonderful. I think what I'm hearing as a core theme coming out of our panel is this importance of the role of women, having equitable power and being in place to act on supporting society and building resilience at all levels. So at the community level, at the municipal government level, and at the national government level, women in those leadership roles at all scales will be essential to our capacity to build resilience going forward. I'd like to thank you, Mami and Michelle, for joining us. Thank you for this quick but very insightful and thoughtful dialogue. And thanks to all of you for joining us today.